Okay, great. I think we just get started. Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining. We want to talk about open source workflows, about Bpmn, about Camunda BPM. My first question is always for my personal statistics, who is already familiar with Bpmn here in the room? That's quite a lot. Who already knows Camunda, maybe a bit? Okay, that's half of the audience actually, which is actually a lot. Yeah, just give you a very, very quick introduction into Camunda. We're a small company. We're based in Berlin. We are currently around 30 people. We are that's always interesting for open source vendors. We don't have any venture capital, so I'm one of the founders. That's one of the things about me. My name is Bernd Rücker, and yeah, I think that's already the most important stuff. So we're not somehow vendor capitalist driven. I think that's always important. We're driven by the technology, by our passion for BPM. I myself, I have a Java EE background, so what I want to do today is basically very, very technical. I want to give an introduction, very brief introduction, a lot of live demo and these kind of things. If you have any questions, you can ask me later on. I'm here till 3:30 around that, or you can ask me via Twitter or email or these things. So what is a business process? The demo I want to give today is basically a very easy one. I think that's the classical example for every process. It's vacation request, right? So you want to go on vacation, you that need an approval from your boss normally, and if that's approved, it's normally booked on some leave account, maybe by accounting or by some team assistant or whatever. If it's not approved, maybe you get an email or these kind of things. Okay, so that's a very easy process. That's Bpmn 2.0. It's an ISO standard. Almost everybody knew it, so I don't go into a lot of details of Bpmn 2, but if you have any questions, let me know, right? But this is actually not what we meet out there in the company. So if you look at what BPM is doing, what processes are doing, you see much more complex things. I took two examples from a recent project actually. That's counterparty onboarding. That's actually an interesting one, a big customer in Australia. So if you want to do business with them as a supplier, you basically go through that process. I just picked it because it's a bit more complex, maybe not the nicest layout, but whatever. And that's another interesting example just to see just the average size of processes, because I get asked very often, okay, this vacation request is pretty handy small thing, but how do real life examples look like? And that's actually a pretty good example. It's from a German bank. It's if you want to have a credit card and that's issued, it goes through that process. So all the approval steps and everything that is needed until the end when the card is really issued and sent to you. So this is a pretty good scope for it. If you look at the customers we have, there are quite a lot of them. You can look it up in the internet, but these are typical processes they do. So, for example, for Zalando, what they are doing is really order processing. So if you go to Zalando.com and you order like shoes or clothes or whatever, in the background there's a Camunda process instance started. Or Allianz in Asia, they're doing life insurance applications, or the Swiss Patent Office, they're doing like patent applications, or the Swisscom doing a lot of things around their network management or these kind of things. So what I wanted to give you an idea of is that basically processes are everywhere, and there are a lot of examples you can find. So it's not about vacation requests, even if I do that today for the demo. But it's always important for me to make that hint. So how do you do that today? And the next question for my personal statistics, always interesting. Who has written your own workflow engine in the past? 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, oh, more, 8, 9. So a lot of people actually, right? So what happens very often is that you write it in code, then you see, oh, that's not that nice, I want to externalize that, then you write your own engine. And if you take one thing from that presentation today, then don't write your own engine. It doesn't make sense in 2015. There are a couple of engines out there, even open source ones, even very lightweight ones, which are easy to use. So don't write your own engine. It's always messed up in the end. I see approximately one engine a month at a customer, and it's always a big mess. right? Because it's pretty complex to write an engine with all the details and these kind of things. We will see much more on this later. But you want to have explicit processes. That makes very much sense, right? Don't embed that in code. Don't do it hard-coded. Yeah. So that was a quick introduction. I'm actually trying to make that as fast as possible. So if you have any questions, let me know. So if you're talking about process automation, what we're talking about is human task management, user tasks. That was the approval step in our workflow. And yeah, what's Milestones called system integration or orchestration, like calling services. Okay. I try to avoid the term service orchestration at the moment because it's sometimes a bit confusing. Because with the microservice discussion, what gets up is like choreography versus orchestration, and I think that's not what it's about. So if a process steers a service, that could be in a service, a microservice architecture as well. It just means that we want to execute some kind of service. It doesn't mean that this must be stateless or active or whatever. Yeah, but maybe just a side remark. I want to skip that. So what we have a look at today is the Camunda BPM platform. So Camunda BPM is an open source project. We are there since around 2 years, but we have a very long background in various open source projects. So myself, I was committed in JBPM 3, then 4, then Activity, and now Camunda. And the Camunda BPM platform consists of various components. We will see them in the demo in a minute. So the core is always the engine. So we have an engine which can execute Bpmn. That's what we will have a look at today. We can execute CMMN, which is for case management, and we're currently working on DMN, which is for decision management, for rules, business rules. I will have a couple of slides on that later. But that's a core engine. It's a jar. It's a Java library. It's a Maven dependency, if you want. We have a Java API for that, and we have a REST API, if you want to call it from the outside. The REST API is, I would say 80 to 90%. It should be 100%, but it's never 100% feature complete. So everything you can do with Java, you can do with REST as well. We have own web applications around it, like Cockpit. You will see that for monitoring and task list for end users having their tasks accessible. They're completely HTML5, so that's AngularJS basically, and they're using the REST API beneath. We're having an Eclipse plugin for a Bpmn 2 modeler. You will see that. And that's basically the core platform we will see today. Right? We have a couple of things I don't want to tackle today because of limited time, but we have a tool to doing the round trip with the business analysts tool like Adonis or Enterprise Architect or whatever you have. So if you have a tool in your company which is used for Bpmn modeling, we try to hook into that and getting the Bpmn file from there and basically giving it back. But it's not for today. So we are basically looking at the core platform. Does that make sense so far? You're waiting for lunch, right? Okay, if you have any questions, just shoot them now. It's no problem to interrupt the demo. And I thought a bit about it, but what I want to do today is basically doing something from scratch, because I think that gives you the best impression what you have to do in order to get something running. And the first thing I do is to create a Maven project. Anybody not familiar with Maven? No, great. Okay, I don't have to explain Maven. We're providing a couple of archetypes. So I'm using one of them. So we are in the ConFESS. It gets a bit darker now, that's great. So we name it ConFESS Vacation. That's a nice name, right? Yeah, I don't like that. I specify a couple of properties. So for example, I'm using the Camunda version 7.2.0. Doesn't go into details there now. So what I did, I created a project. I don't have enough yet, so created a new one. Where is ConFESS? There is it. What we basically have, so our idea is always to bring workflow and Bpmn to the, we say, normal developer world, okay, which is, or which might be Java. We're doing a lot of things currently around polyglot programming or other environments, but currently the best support is in Java. So what you have is a Java project. You have the Bpmn file as part of your Java project. Bpmn, we can quickly model our process. So I would say something like there is a vacation request received, for example. Then we have the approval, right? So approve vacation request. That should maybe be done by the management group. Then we have an exclusive gateway, which basically means one or the other way. So we want to check if we have approved the vacation. If yes, I make it easy now. What we have had on the slide, right? So book vacation on leave account might be for accounting, for example, and then the process ends. Or if not, we make it very simple. I want to have a service task which basically sends rejection mail to employee. Okay, and then the process instance ends as well. Can make it a bit nicer actually. There are a couple of interesting studies how many time on average you spend on modeling it nicely, so the layout stuff, which is quite a lot. Okay. Easy, right? So that's our Bpmn process we want to work with. I have to do a couple of things to get it really executable. The first and very important thing is you have to tell the process model it's executable, because that's maybe interesting as well. If I go back to the one I had here, this process model, what the Bpmn is capable of is that not all of the processes or not all parts of it must be really executed on an engine. It might be just for documentation, or you want to model what the ESB is doing or whatever. So you have to explicitly tell the engine which parts are executable. This one, okay. I might want to have a user interface for that process. In order to start the process, I might want to hand in some data. The easiest way, I want to show a couple of ways actually doing that. The easiest way is you can specify a couple of what we call form fields. So I could say you have to specify your name. Maybe could get that from the login, but anyway, it's faster for the moment. So I could have a name. For vacation, I need, let's say, a start date. Starting from, I try to be fast in typing actually. If you have questions in the meanwhile, let me know. I can normally answer and type at the same time. End date, ending at, yeah, we leave the typos there. So that could be a very easy form in actually to get started. Then we provide some data. The data is stored with a process instance in our database. Okay, so we can have a process instance, we can have data attached to it. Then we have this user task, which is assigned to management. That's fine. I don't provide any form for that because I want to show you something in a minute. And then we need the approval step. And what we do there for the decision for the gateway, we have on the outgoing flows, on the outgoing sequence flows, we can specify conditions. We leverage the Java Unified Expression language there by default. I guess you might know that from JSF or other things. So you could, for example, you could access Spring or CDI beans here and can use that dot notation for doing something. But I can always access process variables, which I have written to the process instance earlier. So if it's not approved, I go this way. If it's approved, I go this way. We will see where we get the approved from in a minute. Okay. The last thing I have to do in order to have it executable, by the way, a good way to test if this is already deployable could be a unit test. So what I did not do here, but which you could do is really following a test first approach. So what we have is we have integration in JUnit. So we have an own JUnit rule, which basically in the background starts up an engine with an in-memory database. Okay. So and we have a deployment annotation we provide. So what this basically means, if when I go into the test case, we are sure we have an engine running in memory. So that's basically clean. And it deploys that process into that engine, so I can immediately start process instances from it. So I could have a process engine. Don't have to care where that is coming from for the moment. We have a couple of services we can use in order to talk to the engine. And that means we could, for example, start a new process instance. Okay. And that could be that ConFESS vacation process. Make sense so far? I hope so. The next thing would, I don't want to go into too much details of the API at the moment, but we will make a bit more tests here in a minute. So what I can immediately do, I can run that. I don't need a server, anything. It's just started, and I get exceptions from the parsing. That's actually what I wanted to have. So what it tells me is that one of the attributes, class, delegate expression, blah blah blah, on service task is missing. So so I quickly see, okay, I need some configuration for that service task. And for service task, we have a couple of options, but basically we are calling Java code. And so there are a couple of ways to attach the Java code to it. The easiest is using or writing a Java class, implementing an interface from us, and just pointing the process model to that Java class. That's the easiest thing. Then we do a new instance of it ourselves. You could use expression language there again, so you could use Spring Beans or CDI Beans as well. So there are a couple of options. You could use OSGI and Blueprint and these kind of things as well. So there are a couple of options actually to run. Okay. So if we have that, our test case should be green actually, which is the case. So right, so now it's deployable. It's already started. And now what you can do, that's actually pretty cool. We have an assertion API. So you could say a third that process instance is started. That makes sense. Is not ended. So it's not yet in the end state, because we're waiting in that approval step, right? So I can test that as well. So normally we give good names to the IDs. So I can say user task approve vacation request. And I can check that I'm really waiting at exactly one activity, which is the user task approve vacation request. So that's checking that the process instance is in the right state. And I could check that there is now a task for a user, and this is task. No, how is that? Good that we have code completion. Somewhere it should be candidate groups. Task has candidate group management, right? It should be assigned to management. So this is something we can easily assert, and what we focused on here is that we really have readable tests. So it's not very verbose. You don't have to use a lot of API methods to do that. It's really straightforward and it's really readable, right? So you can write test cases there easily. And now if you want to complete the task, again, there are a couple of shortcuts. We could just say complete the task, and that basically means the last task that I asserted from that process instance. And so that means as soon as I do this, the process moves on. What will happen if I execute that? Just checking if somebody is awake. There's an exception, right? Why? Exactly. Unknown property used in expression approved. So I used the process variable approved here. And I haven't specified that. I haven't handed over that to the process. So that's something I have to do, obviously, in the test. I can easily do that. We are using a map of process variables, so you don't have to declare variables. You're just having a map interface. I can always hand over variables. So we could have variables, create variables, and then we put the approved. Well, that's, I think, the fastest way of doing that. What's the problem here? Yeah. There's a different put value. There we have fluent interface to getting back a map. So that's working now. and then the process moves on. Don't want to go into more details here now, but we have a couple of examples online as well where we're using mocks in order to, if you're now using like an email service, for example, that you can mock that out, but still running the delegate and a couple of other things. We have examples for behavior-driven development with Cucumber or JBehave. So you really can do a lot of things around testing very easily. We have a coverage tool, that's pretty cool actually. Then you get a HTML report where you see on the process definition marked graphically which paths you executed in your unit tests and which not. So you see the coverage of it. So a lot of things about testing, but don't have the time to show all of them. But I think that's one of the very big advantages, right? We call that embeddable engine. I have a slide on that later on. But I can run the engine as a jar, as a library, without any environment. So that makes it possible to run it in a unit test. That's not true for most of the BPM suites out there, and that's what makes it, I think, really applicable or really sexy for a Java developer. Okay, so we basically tested our process. I mean, at least I could check that the process instance is now ended, right? It's ended. And then we could say, okay, that's already maybe sufficient for testing for the moment. Ah, it's not ended. Why it's not ended? Ah, I have a second task, right? If I reject it, I go that way, and then we will directly execute the delegate, and then we are ended. So that's maybe the quicker way of testing it for the moment. Okay. And what you can see my system out print line from the delegate. Not that amazing, maybe. The next thing what I can do, I just add the Bpmn file to my Maven project. We have a marker file which is comparable to persistence XML or on beans XML from CDI, where it just have to be there that we know there is a Bpmn file within your artifact. And we have to have a process application class. Don't want to go into details why that is there. And what you can do there, what you can do then, and that's pretty cool. You just build it via Maven. My test is invoked. I get a war file. The war file contains my Bpmn file and the delegate classes. And I can take that war file and actually go to a container, which in my case is a JBoss 7.2, could be Wildfly as well, it could be a WebLogic, could be a WebSphere, could be a Glassfish, could be a Tomcat, it actually doesn't matter. And I just drop the war file in the container. And wait a second, let me do two things at the same time. So if I drop that there, it gets picked up by my JBoss and deployed. Hopefully if I pick the right JBoss, right. And what we have a mode of the engine where we run it as service of the container of my JBoss already. So what it can do, it finds the Bpmn file within my deployment, automatically deploys it on the engine. Okay, I'll come back to that in a slide in a minute. And then what you can use, then you can use the graphical tool. So if JUnit is not yet sexy enough, we can go to the web tools. So what I can immediately do, I can start a process instance of that process. I have to clean up actually. So ConFESS vacation is the process I just deployed, so it's there. What you can see is that we automatically generate a simple HTML form from these fields. So I can say I want to go to vacation from, let's say, tomorrow, because it was quite exhausting, till next week, whatever. I start the process. What happens in the background, we can see that in Cockpit. So task list was the web application for the end user, right? So this is for me going to vacation. Cockpit is for the monitoring. So there I have an overview of all running processes in my engine. So there should be a ConFESS vacation process. So you see what we just modeled. I see there's one process instance currently in that state. You can do a lot of graphical stuff here, like filtering via clicking and these kind of things and whatever. I can go into that single instance, so I see all the data attached to it. I could even change it, or I can add new variables, all these kind of things. And I see the user task, I see which group it's assigned to, and a lot of things there. So you really have a lot of transparency of your process instance here. And when I go to the task list, now I'm again the end user, I'm in management, right? I assigned it to the management group, so I see my task in the management group filter. Basically what we do here, you can define your own filters. So I could create an own filter where I define which filter criteria I want to have. We just normally prepare a couple of out-of-the-box filters like my tasks or all group tasks I'm in. So that means if I'm in management, I automatically see that task here. Makes sense so far, I hope. So I see that task. One thing I normally have to do if it's assigned to the group, I have to claim it. So that means nobody else of the group is doing it. If two people try to claim at the same time, one wins. And as I didn't specify any form fields or any form here, what happens is that I get a generic form. So you can see basically all the variables which are in the process. And you can, as an end user, maybe not, but for rapid prototyping, it's pretty cool. I can immediately add new variables. So for example, I make the proof, I make it true. I think it was called approved, so you can even see that. So if I try to complete it, I get, again, the unknown property. So for rapid prototyping, it's pretty neat to have these kind of capabilities to not specifying forms. So I use that here, I complete it. So the next task is the book vacation and leave account. I think that's not that thrilling at the moment, right? So you can imagine how that runs through. One interesting thing I want to show you, I've prepared something here. The one thing which I have to prepare because I didn't want it to write it from scratch actually. What you can do instead, you can provide own HTML forms if you like. So if you're not happy with it with these form fields, you can provide HTML forms. You can see that they're pretty easy HTML, right? So a couple of divs. We have integration into Angular, so you have a couple of things you can use it here, like binding that input field to a process variable. Okay, so that's actually very easy to do. The cool thing about it, and we have examples using that, you can still use JavaScript in there, so you can program your own JavaScript. You can use Angular in there. You have a couple of things you get injected there, so you can, if you want to, you can build still very rich applications, like searching for customers or validating stuff or these kind of things. And then you can just attach that to the process. Okay, so I could say the approve request. Just have to check the time, but that's something we do quickly. So I can say the approve HTML, and I want to have that embedded in the task list, shown embedded in the task list, and it should be loaded from the application, so the app, which is basically means that var, and I have the approve HTML. So that should work. And the second thing I want to add, and that's basically it for the demo for the moment. I want to have a timer, because that's pretty interesting to show. That's our capabilities a process engine can do and Bpmn can deliver. So you don't have to program that yourself. You can just say if the approve vacation request takes too long, I make for the demo, I make 50 seconds. Should be enough, right? To approve a vacation request. And then I go on a second task. Some escalation task. Just to make that more tricky, what you can do in Bpmn, you can say that this timer is non-interrupting, it's called. So if I remove the cancel flag, it's dotted, and that means I do the other thing in parallel. I don't cancel the approval user task, but I do the other one in parallel. We will see how that behaves in a second. And then I specify the duration. The 15 seconds I entered here is readable for the human. I enter it readable for the machine, which means period time 15 seconds. It's an ISO format. There's a pretty good Wikipedia article about it. It's not very hard to do. So what I can do, I can redeploy it. I always do that with a small ARN file, actually. think I get killed here for that, I don't know. I build it via Maven and copy it to my JBoss. I could use a Maven plugin, but that actually works in every environment. So what I get a new process definition, I get a new version of it. So that's interesting as well. So what we are doing in the background is versioning of the process models. So if you have started process instance in the old version, it keeps running in the old version. But if I start a new process, I have to enter some stuff. Wait a second. So if I start a new process, it's already started in the new version, right? The old one, where's the old one? That's actually seems to be a bug in the task list. Because I have the old one still running in the old version and my new one running in the new version. That's an important thing here. And what you can already see is that the one instance after 50 seconds, it run into the escalation task in parallel, right? So a couple of things which are happening automatically in the background. What you can do as well, don't want to go into all the details, but you can see the path you run through in a process model afterwards. You can do a lot of statistics and how long does it take and these kind of things. So there's much more actually to see here, but it's not enough time to show everything. But what you can see is that this time I provided the HTML form, so the HTML form is shown here. So that's actually pretty easy to get started and to make rapid prototyping, but we have customers really using that in production and using that for even more complex forms. Okay, any questions so far? Yes. Mm-hmm.
I deploy a new version of the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So.
Do they use the latest deployed version class? Or
yep.
My question is also version class, Java class?
Question understood. So I understood the question. I repeated because I forgot the microphone actually. The question is, if I change the class, is the class somehow versioned as well? And the answer is it depends on how you run it, but normally it's not. So normally, what I did, I rebuilt the var, I redeployed it, so the class is exchanged because the class is the normal class path of the server. We don't do anything special there. So the class has to be either backwards compatible or use some naming convention or these kind of let's say, normal tricks. You could use in a container like in a Java E container, basically, you can use parallel deployment, or in every container. Tomcat can do that as well. Where you say I have a version deployment, different vars, var 1, var 2, var 3. Then you can have different classes, but it's a bit more complex in order to get that running. But it's possible. But we normally try to avoid it because it adds a lot of complexity, not only for development, but also for operating. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the question was, can I migrate process instances like I have that in version 2 here, or the other one in version 1? Can I migrate that to the new version? And the answer is you can within certain limits. So there might be changes in your process model which are not compatible. Like I remove that task. Then it's not possible. And we have actually, we don't have a button in Cockpit because that's more, you can do it via the API, via some internal API, and we have a documentation where you have all the limits documented. So we want to force the people to read that documentation before they do it. But what we are currently building, and that is actually pretty cool, in the 7.3 release, which will be there in May, we will have capability in order to change existing process instances, to modify the state. So you could, for example, say I want to cancel that token which is currently waiting here and want to start a new one here. We have that often in operations, like I want to repeat an activity, I want to jump or skip something. And that makes a migration easier, because then it could even cancel an old process instance, start a new one, and specify which activities you want to start it. But overall, it's migration is not always easy to do. So you have to think a bit about it. That's why it's not a button. Great. Let me quickly switch back to the slides. I had a couple of them actually, and then we can go into more questions. So I hope that was actually not too basic. Who thinks that was too basic as an introduction for the live demo? Nobody. That's great, because I'm always thinking, oh, maybe the people are getting bored by making the next very easy process. But that's great. So one very important thing I wanted to mention, I mentioned that briefly, is we have different modes running the engine from an architecture point of view, and that's very important actually. So what I used in the JUnit test is what we call an embedded engine. So we used basically the engine as a jar. The only dependency we have is Apache MyBetis for the persistence and a JDBC driver to the database. Not much, not more, right? So you can run with these 3 jars. That's what we do in a unit test, and that's what you could do if you want to embed it in your own application. Then you build one war or one ear or whatever, where you embed our jars into your war and start up the engine in your own life cycle, like with Spring or whatever, Spring Boot or don't know, actually doesn't matter. Then you run the application yourself. Another mode is what we call shared process engine. There we run the engine as part of the container. That's what I had. The engine is started as service of my JBoss or Tomcat or whatever. That's a bit like what we do in Java EE, like with persistence or CDI or transactions or JMS. It's just there, right? You just say, if you have CDI, you just say add inject process engine. That's it. You don't have to care about the configuration. And another great thing about that is that then you can deploy different war files containing Bpmn files, which all connect to the same shared engine. And you have one like cockpit, one operating tool, seeing all the processes from the different deployments. You don't have to build one huge deployment in order to manage your process engine. Okay, that makes deployment much easier actually. And this is normally the default mode we recommend if you don't have anything against that. It might be that you have a company-wide default Tomcat you cannot adjust. You cannot have like a shared library added. Then this is not possible for you, but normally we run in that mode, and that's actually pretty nice to have. Is that understandable? More or less. Ask me later if you have questions to that, because that's very important. There's a third mode, which is the default for a lot of the big BPM suites out there, which run as a standalone server. So if you buy tool XYZ from a 3-letter vendor, they install it as a separate server. And then the only possibility you have is to talk remote to it, like SOAP or REST. And then the only thing it can do if it want to call services is talking REST, SOAP, or these kind of things. It might be an interesting model if you're running in a very polyglot environment, if you're running in a SOA environment, then this might be a model for you. It's possible with Camunda as well. But it's if you want to make it closer to your Java development, if you want to make it more lightweight, if you want to make it smaller footprint, basically, then the other ones are much easier to handle. So that's actually what we don't run that often out there. Okay. Great. I have like 10 minutes to go. What I did actually, I collected a couple of things which are pretty interesting what we're doing at the moment, because what I could only do in that very short demo is to give you a tip of the iceberg. But I wanted to do that from scratch, that you get an idea how it really runs and that it's really easy to implement, right? Add a couple of Maven dependencies, add a Bpmn file, and you're basically done. We have a getting started tutorial. Should be easy to do in a couple of minutes. But there's much more to it. So the first thing, which is really important, is that Bpmn is really powerful. I'm not sure. A lot of people knew Bpmn, but I don't know in which details. There are a lot of things you can do with Bpmn, which are really great. So, for example, if you go to our documentation, what you have is you have our Bpmn reference. What you can see there is the whole Bpmn capabilities and everything in Orange, our engine can execute. So you see there's a lot of Orange actually. And there are a lot of elements. So that's really powerful and really cool to have. And it's a great opportunity to do that, what we either call business IT alignment, so basically making the step towards the business analyst or the business, but also to what I call IT alignment. So for example, for operations, that's also a great tool. So what we could do, if a service task fails, we can stop in the service task, raise an incident, make a marker on the service task graphically, okay, we have a problem here, and then they can look in that with the context of the process instance and can retry it, for example. We can remember, for example, the payload we send to a service in order to get an idea what the problem was and these kind of things. So there are a lot of things also about IT and IT alignment or DevOps or whatever you want to call it. So that's great about the BPMN. And the other thing which is really great about BPMN, that nobody really questions it today. Okay, so all the big vendors go for BPMN. And basically all the bigger open source engines go for BPMN. So wrong direction. Yeah, I mentioned that. Which is something which is actually interesting is all the web tools. I get asked very often actually, do people really use the cockpit or task list in production? And the answer is it always depends, but they're doing that more and more. For cockpit, most of the people are doing it. For task list, I would say like whatever, 20 to 30% are doing it. But what we have added to the web applications is a plug-in mechanism in order to basically put your own or implement your own requirements within our frame. So if you say, okay, cockpit is somehow nice, but I'm missing, for example, that that statistics starting page I had here with this JavaScript stuff and nice and these kind of things, you can add that as a plugin. You can write it yourself. It's a piece of HTML, JavaScript, maybe a REST backend, and you package that as a jar, put it on the class path of the web application, and it's there. And you have a lot of plug-in points, like if you're going, for example, to where do we here? We have these tabs. You can add tabs. You can add actions. You can add and these kind of things. So there are a lot of plugins points where you can exchange functionality of cockpit. And we're currently building the same for task list. So if you say, okay, that's nice with the tiles, and I like the Outlook style here and these kind of things, but I don't want to have these bar here, for example, then you can exchange the plugin there. So it's really, really pluggable there. That's pretty cool, actually. And we've built we have a couple of hack days a year. We built the Camunda plugin store in one of them. So it's not the most stable component of the world, but if you're interested, you could go to Camunda org plugins, and you will see a couple of plugins for cockpit, and you can shop them. So they're free, obviously, it's open source, but you can say which of the plugins I want to have, and then you can download a new cockpit, including the plugins. Pretty cool, actually, to play around with. We're building BPMN.io at the moment. That's maybe interesting for a broader audience. So what we're doing there, we're building a web-based model for BPMN. So you can model in the web. We do a lot of things to have a good usability. We test that on touch devices and these kind of things. Maybe the smartphone is a bit small, but at least an iPad works pretty well. So we're building a complete BPMN 2 modeler. We're currently working on the coverage, so we will have complete BPMN 2 support. We will have a couple of nice features in there. So that's first of it. It's completely JavaScript. We don't need a server for it. So it's basically an HTML page with JavaScript, which reads the XML file, renders it, and writes it. So it's self-contained. And what you can do with it, you can use that in order to visualize a BPMN process you might have, and you can have a lot of these annotations. So what we use basically here, showing the diagram, and where I am in the diagram is using BPMN.io with a small overlay. So if you have some requirements where you say, I want to just render a BPMN file and put some annotations on it, that's what BPMN.io can do for you. So there's a very easy JavaScript API. If you want to using a JSF, for example, their WebJAWS project, and So this is really leverageable from various contexts. We're currently on the home stretch, so if you look at the project, there's not yet a 1.0 released, but this will happen this year. We built the basis of it very generic, so the next things we can build on top of it is a CMMN and DMN modeler, but that's just a side remark. Okay, so that's BPMN.io, maybe interesting as well. What we built with it, it's currently kind of a toy project, but it's already in a pretty good shape actually. That's called the Camunda BPM workbench. You can find it on GitHub as well. There we use Bpmn.io in order to model BPMN processes, and then, for example, if you have script tasks, you can add the script directly here in various script languages, and then you can directly say deploy that process to the engine, and can run it within the workbench. Or you can point the workbench to a running process engine on your server, for example, or even in your JUnit test case if you like, and then you can have breakpoints on processes, and then you can directly see, okay, where I am, what is my process context, which variables do I have, and you can check what expression language constructs result in which result basically. So a couple of things you can play around with. Already pretty cool. Yeah, that's a workbench. We have actually basically rebuilt our complete own CI infrastructure. So we as a vendor have the problem, we are supporting various containers, various Java versions, various databases. So we have quite a huge continuous integration environment, and we just migrated completely to Docker, except Microsoft SQL Server, but the rest is Docker. And as a kind of a garbage thing, what we have now, we have Docker images for all our releases, and you can get them directly. So you can directly start a Tomcat with an embedded Camunda engine via Docker. Very easy. You find them on the on our GitHub account, so that's cool as well, actually. And I have an example online as well, where for example, you could use now Docker in your integration test with, for example, JBoss Achillean. Who did understand that in one sentence? Almost nobody, okay. But from the idea, you can now use Docker in order to start a defined environment, so your JBoss with Camunda, for example, and then you can run integration tests on it. And there are a couple of frameworks allowing that. And that basically, in the end, you have an experience like you can say Maven, with a profile and run the test cases, and it downloads the Docker container, runs it, deploys the basically the integration tests, and run them on the defined environment. And that's actually it's like 20 lines of Maven configuration code. That's a cool thing about it. We're currently building CMMN in the engine. CMMN is an own standard, and it's actually hard to explain that in the last 2 minutes. So what I would recommend, if you have any questions about that, ask me later on. I'm here around. I can show you a demo with CMMN as well. The idea, the basic idea is, if you have BPMN, what you do, you have activities in a sequence, right? Activity 1, then activity 2, then maybe, depending on some decision, activity 3 or 4. And what for some processes that doesn't match. Like, for example, organizing this event here, I think it's not a sequence, right? You're having to do a lot of activities, but the event manager normally decides for itself when it does, at which time, and if it's necessary or not. So what CMMN has, it defines activities, so they are predefined, but you don't have a sequence, but you can have additional conditions on the activities, like the tele-interview with the applicant might be done here, but it's not started automatically. That's the play symbol. So somebody who's doing the decision, for example, has to decide that this user task has to be done in this case. And then you can have additional conditions like, but if this is done, then I want to review the result. It's kind of a 4 eyes principle. Okay. Or you could say, yeah, I think that's okay. And I have milestones. There are a couple of interesting things about that. The basic idea is if you don't have the ordering of your tasks, like Bpmn doesn't fit, then CMMN from a couple of the things, it's close to Bpmn, but it doesn't have that order. So you're more flexible. You can combine them, so you can start cases from its processes, and you can start processes from within cases. So it's basically another tool in the stack in order to have the right tool for the right kind of problem. So that's CMMN. It's already there in Camunda BPM 7.2. If you download it, you will get it. We don't have yet the graphical modeler based on Bpmn.io. That's what I mentioned earlier. We're currently building that. We're working on DMN. Don't think anybody knows DMN yet. It's a pretty new standard. It's decision model notation from the OMG as well. So that's about decision management. And that basically what's interesting for us at the moment are decision tables. So it's kind of a rule engine, but it's not like a RETI rule engine like Joules. It's more like more easy decision tables. Don't want to go into details there as well, but this is how a DMN table looks like. It's standardized, so it's depending. Again, you can have different tools for designing that. There already today, there is one which can do that. We're building one, and then you can execute it on the engine, and then you can hook it in, for example, in CMMN or Bpmn. So our goal is to have that in 7.4, which is in November. So not that far away, actually. And there is much more. I think I'm already a bit over time, so I don't want to go into details there. If you have any questions about that, again, I'm here and I'm happy to answer anything. Because I'm asked very often as well, what I want to point out is that with Camunda BPM, we're currently really making a lot of progress. So we're at the moment we have 15 people in the development team and the product team. So it's not like a community project driven by 1 or 2 people. It's really 15 people doing all that stuff I showed you, so we're making a lot of progress. That's pretty cool, actually. And what we see is that we really have good experience with that in the projects, right? Because it's really developer friendly. We call it developer friendly because it's not. I see a lot of people out there and they tell me, oh yeah, BPM, I looked at that 10 years ago or 5 years ago, and it was so awful. It was a mess, very complex. BPM suite, 0 code, and you have to use a lot of wizard, didn't work. And this is not how BPM should be, right? So there are different engines out there, and it makes sense to use them, and it's kind of fun, right? You get the developers on board, and that's an important thing there. If you want to get any information about what I showed today, you have us on the web. There's the Camunda.org website for the open source project, the Camunda.com if you're interested in the what is the enterprise edition, what are the differences. And we have the network that's actually a bit hidden, so I wanted to point it out here. On network Camunda.org, you find a couple of things like meetings. We're currently trying to set up a meeting in Vienna, a community meeting, where we just basically have some exchange between users of Camunda. And what's there as well, if you're want to get started, we have an online training, like with a couple of videos and these kind of things. And you find that on the network as well. It's free, so you can just register there, get the training. You see me a bit more in some videos and get running. We have a tutorial as well. I hope that was kind of interesting. I don't want to stop anybody from going to lunch. Maybe make one last question if there's one. OSGI? That for Camunda or for? So the question was about OSGI. We have an OSGI component. So there's a Camunda BPM OSGI component. We have a distribution as well on Karaf. It's not part of the supported product at the moment. So what I can see is from what we see out there in the market is that not a lot of customers are using it. We get asked a couple of times from the community, that's why it's there. But it's not that big issue actually in most of the projects. From my personal opinion, but that's my personal opinion, I think for enterprise applications, OSGI, a lot of OSGI concepts are a bit too fine-grained, so it's easier to get that in other worlds. So I saw a couple of projects struggling with OSGI, but that's my personal opinion. I mean, if you want to do it, there, no problem there. So the very last question, yeah.
Does any relationship exist between the Camunda workflow and implementation and the activity?
I actually waited for that question. So the question was the relationship between Camunda and activity, and this is it's actually easy to answer. We're part of the activity project in the beginning, so we programmed a lot of code of that, and we forked like 2 years ago, and that's really a fork now. So we're obviously looking what they are doing. I think they're looking what we are doing, but in the meanwhile, we refactored a lot of the core engine code. So the concepts are the same. So migrating is easy. So you basically have to rename from org activity to org Camunda BPM. So it's not a big deal, but in the internals, we changed a lot actually. We got a lot faster. We cleaned up some stuff. We implemented more Bpmn. So there happened a lot. So that makes it even harder in future to exchange stuff. So there are 2 different projects at the moment. So you have basically to select which path you want to go. I have an opinion on that, obviously, but yeah. Okay, so thank you guys for being here. Have a nice remaining day. Yeah.